Hi again, everybody. So here is our second set of slides for week 3, and this is all about primates. Well, we're not going to cover everything about primates because there's a lot, and there's a whole chapter on primates, chapter 4 in the textbook, but here are the pages in the textbook that you need. You can read the whole thing if you want, like with chapter 3 from the previous slides, but this is what we're going to focus on here. So there are some charts you can look at that'll actually be referenced in these slides. And page 79, start at the paragraph that's about chimpanzees and read the rest of the page. And pages 82, 83, there's a section that starts with the subheading, are there patterns, blah, blah, blah. So that's what you're going to read for that corresponds to these slides. So let's get right to it. Don't worry, we'll explain what primates are. But before we start talking about primates, there's a common misconception that people have. People get confused about this. There's this common question and debate, like humans descend from apes and monkeys, and some people are like, no, that's impossible because then there wouldn't be any more apes and monkeys. And it's just to clarify a couple of things here. We sort of do, but at the same time, not really. The thing is that we don't descend from apes and monkeys that exist today. All right. When it comes to apes, they're one grouping within the primate order. So there are different kinds of apes alive today: gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and we're actually classified as apes under this scheme. All right. Bear with me. If you're insulted by that, well, all living things are related. We're not better than them. They're not better than us. So really, it's not a big deal. So the ancestors is that we have common ancestors with today's living primates, and depending on which primates, it's like with what we talked about in the first set of slides. The further distantly related you are, the further back the common ancestry is. So it's like a big family tree, and we'll look at a few trees today to kind of give you that visual. All right, so it's not that we do descend from some apes and monkeys, but that are now extinct, and they're common ancestors of living species that exist today. All right, so if you remember that discussion of common ancestry that we had, there's a link again in the slides to that 3-minute video, 2.5 minutes if you want to be specific, with a guy talking about common ancestry. And so if you looked at the first set of slides on a different day and you don't remember, I invite you to go back and check out that video. So we share common ancestors with today's non-human primates. I say non-human because we are primates too. So sometimes students leave this discussion with the impression, well, there are humans and we're related to primates. We're related to other primates because we're primates. Okay, so it's not humans and primates. There's humans, and then there's other primates, non-human primates. Okay, so today's non-human primates, the ones that are alive today, they're not our ancestors. They're relatives of ours, and we have common ancestors. Okay, now those common ancestors, so the common ancestor that we have with living apes today was some ape-like thing, some species of ape that is now extinct. Okay, and when you go further back, we're more distantly related to monkeys. So we're related to monkeys. That relationship is more distant than that we have with apes. Okay, but we're still more closely related to monkeys than we are to, say, cats, and we're more closely related to cats than we are to fish, and we're more closely related to fish than we are to mushrooms. And, believe it or not, and I just learned this a few years ago, we're more closely related to mushrooms than we are to plants, like trees and flowers. Right? It's kind of freaky. But anyway, if you're wondering, apes and monkeys, they're different groupings within the wider grouping of primates. Generally, apes don't have tails, so Curious George is not actually a monkey. He's probably a chimpanzee, which is an ape. So anyway, that's a pet peeve of mine. So before we can talk about primates, we need to kind of make the connection with what we talked about in the other slides. So how do we classify living things, right? We talked about evolution and change over time, and how through natural selection sometimes you have speciation, or the creation of new species. and they're related through common ancestry. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to know this, but this guy Linnaeus back in the 1700s created a system of classification, and we still use that system today, but it's improved because we know about genetics and things like that now, and natural selection. But the basic idea is still the same, is that living organisms, species, are grouped together by similar physical features. So the species level is really the grouping where the closest relationship happens. And then if you look into this, you can learn more in the textbook. We're not going to go into all that detail in this course. That's, if you take human evolution, you will, but then there's like different levels. So there's species, multiple species are a part of a genus, multiple genuses or genii are part of a family, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that system is taxonomy. Okay, taxonomy refers to a biological classification of various kinds of organisms. And you can see an example in the this definition, it comes from the box on page 71. All right, so I put it in quotation marks to show you that these are not my words. So here, you have all the living things here in this chart here, right? So you have kingdoms. You've heard of kingdoms: animal kingdom, plant kingdom. So they're all related, and the very first life on earth is way down here, and this eventually you had speciation happening here. So there's a common ancestor to all these other life forms. And you have bacteria. They're our most distant relatives, the ones we don't invite to our parties. Then you have another split here, right? So these are different kinds of small celled organisms that we probably can't see. So there are a lot more things in the world than animals and plants, right? And a lot of them are things we don't see. And then you come here, you actually have the plant kingdom here, right, with trees and flowers and grass and all this stuff that's closely related to these other living things. And then here, again, every time there's a branching off, we see common ancestry because of speciation, and you have fungi. All right, so and then the animal kingdom here. So these are, in biology, you might have memorized these things, right? So phylum, you have like vertebrates and all that. Class, mammals, and so you go down here and you get more and more specific, right? So we're part of the animal kingdom, we're vertebrates, we're mammals, we're primates, and then within primates you have different families, different genii, and different species. So again, we're not going to go into tons of detail into that. It's just to give you an idea. So here is, and this is from page 47, it's a screenshot, and so you have the animal kingdom, right, and the divisions within the animal kingdom. So phylum, right, chordata, subphylum, vertebrata, classes, you have different classes. So we're mammals, but there are all these other classes here, and then within mammals you have other divisions. So it's like a giant filing cabinet, right, categorizing things depending on the relationship. And then this goes all the way down to the here they stop at subfamilies here, but then you do have some species listed down here underneath, right? So it gets more and more, the relationships get closer and closer, and the closer the relationship, the more you have in common. So again, species, you have a lot in common, and this chart here kind of shows, it's hard to see on here, but the bigger, so here is actually, you can't read it probably, but it's kingdom, Animalia, so the animal kingdom, and you have a lot of them in there because all the animals are in there. And when you get more specific, so here you have phylum, well, you have fewer in each phylum and then fewer in each class, so there are fewer mammals than there are chordata, things with spinal cords, because all mammals have spinal cords, but not all things with spinal cords are mammals, right? So it just gets more and more specific. That's kind of all you really need to know at this point. A lot of you probably already know this from biology. So again, connections to previous material, we have speciation. So in any kind of tree that you see, there's an incidence of speciation here at every branching off. So one species leading to the existence of two or more other species, and common ancestry. So this species here at the juncture is a parent species to the other ones. And this is a chart from page 72, so you can look at this in your textbook. So again, we're just going to go over this real quick, and we were talking about the finches in the last slides, right? So we looked at this other chart with finches that came from the textbook, and you had a parent species that wind up splitting into different species because of migrations to different islands with different environments. So again, this all has to do with adaptation. And here's another example, right, with felines. You had at some point in time one species of feline, and over time with different evolutionary processes you wind up having the different kinds of felines that exist today. They're all related. Cats are related to leopards and lions and jaguars and tigers and all these things. You know, so they're all related and they have a common ancestor. So it's like that with all living things. So speciation has been happening over and over again for billions of years. Again, we have another thing here of life on Earth. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth emerged, and you know, at some point you have formation of life forms, and over all these times, all these life forms this is where these trees develop, and you have speciation and the creation of new species. Okay, and eventually here towards the end, we've been around for a few million years now. Okay, and but we're still just at the tail end here. So in terms of humans, how does this have to do with humans? Well, here's our species here, Homo sapiens, and you know, at each level we see, you know, again, we go to the other extreme. We're part of the animal kingdom. We're chordates. We're mammals. And mammals, as a class, are divided into a whole bunch of orders, all right? And our order that we belong to is primates. And then the primates are divided into different families. We're in the hominid family. The families are different, just split up into geni, so plural of genus, and ours is Homo. And within that, we're the species Homo sapiens. Okay, so at each level we're grouped with organisms that share common adaptive traits. So we have a lot of adaptive traits in common with other mammals, for example. But then when you put all the primates together, they have shared characteristics that other mammals have, but some of them make primates unique, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So if we zoom in on the primate order, because that's where we're going with this, primatology is the study of primates. In particular, the primatologists are interested in studying primates because that can give us clues about our origins. You know, the things that we have in common with other primates, both culturally and biologically, and how we're different from them can give us some clues. So primatology is a subfield within biological anthropology. So here is one example of a primate tree, right? So you have, you know, at some point here you have the very first primate that emerged, and this is after the dinosaurs disappeared, you know, and went extinct, I should say. And when dinosaurs were around, you know, little mammals had a, you know, it was rough to be a mammal in those days. I know, I was there. No, just kidding. I'm not that old. Don't say it. I know you're itching to, but you can't because we're not face-to-face. There are advantages to online teaching. So, I kid, and I like it when my students joke around too. It's all good. So, you know, you had a common ancestor here that, you know, it was some mammal that mammalian species that managed to, you know, survive the dinosaur era, and then they were allowed to propagate more because there was less danger after the dinosaurs went extinct, and so they spread around and they adapted to different environments, and then some of them, you know, wound up adapting, and over time here you probably have different species that led up to existing lemurs today. So if you used to watch that show Zaboomafoo, well, we're related to Zaboomafoo, but very distantly. Okay, we're not as closely related to Zabumafu as we are to Curious George, who's actually a chimpanzee. And then then you had one incidence of speciation here, and then the common ancestor that led to all these other lines. So you have, New World monkeys. That terminology is kind of gross because, Old World refers to everything that's not North and South America, and New World is, I don't think there are primates in North America that are, that were originally come from here, but South America mostly. So that terminology is kind of gross and icky and colonial, but it is what it is. So New World monkeys found in South America, which, if you look at it through time, if you already know the continents at one point were fused together, so these emerged, these incidences of speciation, these older ones here, because you see across time that this kind of happened, this split happened when these continents were still fused together. And then you have Old World monkeys here. So we're up here, right? We're more closely related to Old World monkeys than we are to New World monkeys. So you have an important split here because this one leads to all these monkeys, and this one here leads to apes. Okay? And you have the great apes, and you have a wider family of apes. So these are groupings, and all these are examples of speciation and common ancestry at each juncture here. Okay? And the further back you go to find a common ancestor, the more distant the relationship is. Okay, so humans and chimps, and they could put bonobos here too, we're kind of like cousins, or siblings maybe, more like cousins. But the further back you go, the further the more distant the relationship is. Okay, so that's one primate tree. You have some in the book as well. So page 73, you have one, and it's kind of top to bottom instead of side to side, and it doesn't really show the time, but it still gives you a good idea, because then this is the primate order. It's split up into these suborders, and the suborders are split up into infraorders. It can get really detailed, and if you're into that kind of thing, it's great, but it can be annoying too. And then superfamilies, right? So again, here we're at one extreme, right? We're under the Hominoidea superfamily, which is apes, including humans, and then at the other end you have lemurs, right? And the further you go, the more distant the relationship is. Here's another, this is from page 83. So again, this one goes from bottom to top. And I put them all there to give people with different brains a chance to kind of see it in different angles. So primates are mammals, right? We're a subcategory of mammals. So what do we have in common with other mammals? These, among other things. So, things that make mammals mammals are also true of primates. So we are one kind of mammal, but not all mammals are primates. How are primates different from other mammals? This is where it gets interesting for us. Primates in general have a larger brain relative to the size of their body, which has implications for cultural developments. We have flatter faces, right? Compare us to a cat or a wolf. We have a flatter face, and that kind of goes with a decreased sense of smell. So if you have cats and dogs, you know that they rely a lot on smell. We rely more on our vision. And for primates, how our vision is different from that of, say, cats and dogs is that we have 3D or stereoscopic vision. And when you look at page 82, you'll see a little diagram of that. It's because our fields of vision of our two eyes overlap. And that's what allows us to see in 3 dimensions. Okay, so we rely more on our vision. So it was that's kind of an adaptation that happened with our faces becoming flatter and our nose becoming flatter, relying less on smell and more on vision. We have fewer teeth than other mammals. There's some other unique primate traits that you'll learn about when you read these pages here. As young ones, we're dependent on our parents for a longer period of time. That's because it takes our brains longer to develop, okay? And we rely more on learned behavior. So even non-human primates, and the more closely related to us that they are, the more they have signs of rudimentary culture. All primates have prehensile hands, meaning we can grab things like a pen or a screwdriver or a branch, right? And other than humans, other primates, a lot of them also have prehensile feet. And, so what helps our hands be prehensile? They list a bunch of things. I included a couple here only, but we have opposable thumbs, right? You can go like this with your thumb. Cats and dogs, like with their paws, they can't do that with their digits, right? Not to this extent anyway. So we can do this, and primates who are not human can also they also have opposable big thumbs. We're going to learn when we talk more specifically next week about human evolution that was part of standing upright, is that our feet, our big toe aligned with the other toes. But other primates still have that opposable big toe, which helps them grab things with their feet in the same way that they're able to with their hands. Primates that have tails, so some kinds of monkeys, not all of them, but some kinds of monkeys also have prehensile tails, so they can grab things with their tails. And you've seen this probably in the media, right? Swinging from branches with their tails. We also have nails instead of claws, right? So that helps with being prehensile as well. And this all, again, has to do with what we're talking about with evolution and natural selection and adaptation to the environment. The first primates that existed, and most of the primates that exist in the world today, not all, but were adapted to an arboreal life, living in the trees. So things like being able to grab, that's helpful, right? When you're climbing through trees. 3D vision is helpful, because if you didn't have 3D vision, it would be harder to assess distance when you're leaping from one tree to the next, right? That said, of course, there are other kinds of animals that have adapted to forest environments, but they adapted in different ways. So any environment has multiple ways that a species can adapt to it, okay? There's not just one way. This was one way, and it allowed primates to flourish over many areas. Some, in a textbook you'll read this too, there are some scholars who speculate that some of the adaptive traits, and in particular maybe some of the stuff having to do with digestion, because there's a lot of study there as well. We're not going to get into that, but it's there. And, some primates eat insects, but at some point in time, some primates started to focus more on eating plants. Okay, but different primates today have different diets, and again, that's something you can study if you're interested in that. But and that has to do with adaptation as well. What's available? What do you digest? So where we're going, and to wrap things up in the last couple of slides, we saw all those trees where you had all these categories of primates, and then we said, well, we wind up in this great ape category. So there's the ape family, and within that there are the great apes. And here again, you have a tree, and at each juncture there was a common ancestor, right? So the first ape existed about 12 to 16 million years ago, all right? And that's not the same as any of the apes that exist today. So when we said in the first slide, we're not descended from today's living apes. We're not descended from orangutans or gorillas or chimps and bonobos. We're descended, all of us, from some common ancestor that was the first ape species. And there were divergences here, right? And within this, you have different branchings, right? So there are different species within these categories as well. Humans too, right? So there's Homo sapiens today, but next week we'll talk about how there have been other species of humans, or hominins, okay? Apes, scientifically, are known as hominoids. All right, so then here you have the chimpanzees and the bonobos. They're our closest relatives that exist today, and the branching off, our common ancestor between chimpanzees and bonobos lived about 4 to 6 million years ago. Some people say it was more like 8 million, so depending on what chart you're looking at when it was created, and here's a contemporary human being, right? But there were others before, and there were probably other splits here that led to the existence of today's chimps and bonobos. So part of what you're going to read, so page 79, there's a few paragraphs there that talk a little bit about chimpanzees and bonobos. Again, they're our closest living relatives, so a lot of primatologists have spent a lot of time learning about them, so because that can give us clues about our own evolution. So there are similarities between chimps and bonobos, but we're going to look at some of the things that just generally about them. So one thing that is very striking Chimps tend to be a little bit more male dominated, and bonobos, among bonobos, females play a greater role. So you'll see sometimes in chimps, males will try to dominate each other. So they're hierarchies in both, but among chimps, it tends to be the males, and they'll tend to dominate over females. That doesn't mean the females are completely passive and don't have any power, but it's just there's this tendency. Whereas among bonobos, there are hierarchies among females and among males. But for a male to have any kind of alpha status, he has to have an alpha mother. Right? So it's a male status depends on the status of his mother. And so it's interesting, right? So they're more egalitarian in that sense than chimps, even though there are still some hierarchies within the genders. But females don't necessarily dominate males, and males don't dominate females. Something that's been observed among bonobos a little bit, but more among chimps, is that there's some level of tool use. So tools are anything that we make or modify from the environment. So taking a stick and stripping the leaves and twigs off of it and sticking it in the ground to get termites or ants, that's tool use. Or taking a leaf to soak up some water and then using it to get that water, that's tool use. And that's cultural. It's something that you learn. Bonobos. So along with the fact that females play a greater role, one thing that researchers find really interesting about bonobos is that they socialize through sex. So if there's a conflict, it'll be resolved through sexual activity. If they come across, they're in the woods, they're doing their thing, they come across a huge spread of food, like a lot of fruit or something, you know, that's stressful, right? It's like, so they start having a lot of sex before they even start to eat. So that's interesting, and it includes same-sex interactions. So again, these are kind of some of the things we can look at, because sometimes people tend to assume that patriarchy or male dominance among humans is something natural. Well, it isn't really. I mean, it's not inevitable, and first of all, we'll learn later that it's not the case for all cultures in the world, and it hasn't always been the case among humans that males have been dominant, okay? So that's evolutionary psychology nonsense. I'm sorry, but there's no scientific justification for saying that male dominance among humans is the norm, all right? But also, sometimes people will say, well, look at all the other animals. And it's not true that all the other animals are male dominant. Sometimes the behaviors have been misinterpreted by people who would project contemporary human ideas onto animals, right? So sometimes people will refer to wolves, but if you dig, you find literature that says, well, no, not really. Males aren't necessarily dominant. So in some species they are, in some species they're not. And what's interesting for us is our two closest relatives, one of them is a bit more male dominant and the other one's a bit more egalitarian. So it's like, okay, well, the common ancestor that we had with them, it could have gone either way, right? Tool use is something that we see among both. And not just chimps, not just bonobos, but some other apes, even some monkeys. You see some signs of some kind of tool use. It gets more sophisticated the more closely related they get to us. And sexuality, right? So again, if anybody, sometimes people will say things like, oh, homosexuality is not natural. Well, there are plenty of other animals who do it, including some of our closest relatives, right? So there's nothing abnormal or unnatural about same-sex behavior. So if any of you are dealing with homophobic relatives, go ahead and tell them that. Look at the bonobos, all right? And some other animals. So there you go. Both of them are partial bipeds, and this is going to be important for next week's material, because we're going to look at how humans are different from apes in terms of being habitual bipeds or full bipeds, walking on two legs, all right? Bonobos do it a bit more than chimps. Gorillas do it a bit too, but bonobos can do it for quite some time, but they don't do it all the time. But they can stand up on both legs, both feet, and carry things with both their hands, which can be advantageous in some situations. So again, it leads us to think, if our closest relatives can do this even better than any other ape, well, then we can think about like our common ancestors with them, and that is going to help us think about the origins of humans next class. If you're really interested in chimps and bonobos, there's a video called The New Chimpanzees. You can click here. It's about an hour long, so if you're really interested in, sometimes I show bits of it in class when we're face to face. Just a content warning, if you're squeamish, around like between minute 25 and 27, there's some kind of violence that's a bit gory, so if you're squeamish, and you might want to just kind of skip over those 2 minutes. So that's it. If you have any questions about primates, let me know.